Hi everyone, this is your host Annie Zhang, and this is Hello Metaverse. If you've been plugging into the world of DAOs lately, you've certainly heard of FWB, which stands for Friends with Benefits. In many ways, FWB is the cool kid on the block, the connector that taps into all the right scenes. It's brought creatives, artists, technologists, builders, and anyone who's in the intersection of culture and Web3 together. Now, what differentiates FWB from any other social clubs or scenes is that its members have a shared bank account powered by the blockchain. Like any other DAO, decentralized autonomous organizations, decisions on how they want to operate, what initiatives they want to pursue, and how they want to spend their money are all decided by the community. Today, I speak with someone who probably has the coolest job title I know. Alex Zhang, known simply as Zhang, is the mayor of FWB. As one of the early and key community builders within the DAO, he thinks deeply about how to evolve the operations and governance of DAOs to be more like that of a city. He's deeply embedded in the community building space, having previously been the president of Summit, a global community that has done innovative projects like buying an entire ski resort for their members. And as a result, he's passionate about how to evolve communities with budgets to exist outside the confines of corporate structures and with a more organic, member-driven structure. As a disclosure, all opinions and points of view in this podcast are my own. It does not represent the views of Roblox, my current employer, and is not affiliated with the company. Now here is my conversation with Alex Zhang. Hi, Alex. So honored to have you. Exciting to meet someone who is officially titled the mayor of FWB. What an interesting title. What I want to start with today is really the fundamentals of what Friends with Benefits DAO is. So why don't we kind of give a quick overview for listeners? What is FWB and how did it get formed initially?
First off, thank you, Annie, for having me, and excited to hang out and get to know each other a bit more and kind of talk about exciting things that are happening in your world and ours. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a bit. What is FWB? It's my favorite question because everyone has different answers for it, which I think is honestly the sign of a really dynamic and interesting community and an experiment. I think it isn't as straightforward as, say, a startup or a company where like this is our singular feature or reason for existence because of its co-created sort of collective nature. And so what is FWB from sort of a zoomed out level? First and foremost, it's a community. It's a community of creatives, artists, technologists, thinkers, builders, people who like to hang out. It's sort of really anything and everything in between, but sort of like a scene, right? And that it's a collective of people who all are really interested in this intersection of culture and Web3, and most importantly, sort of how Web3 affects culture at large. I think what's different for FWB than other, say, other communities, other scenes that might have existed throughout history is this experimentation in which everyone who's a part of this community also owns this community through the tokenization of the fundamental sort of structure in and of itself. And so it's this idea that to join FWB, one holds the FWB token, which is an ERC20 liquid fungible token that you can either buy or be gifted or trade, or we've seen a myriad of different use cases for it, to then join this network, to join this community, where then you're able to participate across a host of different sort of avenues, from hanging out online in the Discord, where there's over 100 channels of different topics, from lifestyle, trading, NFTs, all the way to art, music production, keyboard setups, selfies and fits. The range is really quite large. To our physical events, where we throw in-person events in major cities all around the world, organized by the community, to consuming with our editorial platform, to going to our very own festival we're actually producing in a week. So the avenues of kind of community created areas for people to engage and connect with one another are fully present in there. And it all sort of ladders up to sort of the core reason for why we're here, which is, I think, to create a space where like-minded, like-value people in Web3 culture are able to really connect, learn, discover, make mistakes, figure things out within this sort of wrapper of a DAO. And that FWB is a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, where proposals sort of govern how FWB exists and makes major decisions, and everything is on chain. So all funds spent coming in or out of the treasury are viewable by all community members. And so this experimentation of what does a community look like, that's bound together through this sort of shared financial and social instrument. What sort of opportunities or levers does that present this group of people when figuring out and sort of collectively defining where it goes from here?
That's fascinating. And clearly there's so much range, and FWB is, one of the first to quite define this category of a DAO, which is a social DAO. But I want to hear the genesis story. Like, how did it turn from nothing to where it is today, which is a fully governed community of extremely engaged contributors and participants?
So the genesis story precedes me, actually, and is quite a fun one. Trevor McFredris, who sort of founded Friends with Benefits, he's sort of been a long time creative, was a DJ before, a music manager, worked across many different disciplines, taught himself to code, created the company Bread, which spawned Lil Michaela, the CGI virtual influencer. So I think Trevor, and I have had a relationship for many years, and I've always been interested in like the intersections of new media, technology, culture, the sort of implications between all of them. And so when he had started Friends with Benefits, I believe August of 2020, it was an experiment. It was like a weekend hackathon project. And the idea was, he created this ERC20 token, FWB. He sent it to a bunch of his friends. Web3 wasn't even called Web3 yet. Other people who were interested in crypto, other people who were interested in the arts and technology and culture. And it was sort of born out of this group chat that had already sort of previously existed that I believe was like on Facebook or something.
Facebook of all chats.
I know, right? I think it was a Facebook group, that or sort of a Telegram chat, but it sort of sent it around to this 30 or 40 folks and just kind of began to watch it and see what happened. And so what started to happen was people began to add and send their friends tokens. People who wanted to get in started to buy tokens. It was just sort of what we called early club dynamics, right? It was this little cool social club had popped up on the internet, just like a nightclub. People were having fun inside. People were bringing their friends inside through the back door. People on the outside who wanted to get in were waiting in line to sort of buy tickets to come. People who wanted to brag were buying bottle service, spending exorbitant amounts of money to get in. So it's just like an interesting study. And like, if you can create something that's socially or culturally interesting, can that sort of attract interesting and the right people? And then two, if you set up the right sort of incentive structure or the right social structure, is there a way where that collective group of people feels enough ownership in it to sort of collectively grow it? And that was sort of the second and important key study in that early experiment, was really effective value distribution to the network. I think we'd all been a part of different social circles, different social networks, anything from a small indie music scene all the way to something as large as we are or were a part of Facebook at some point in our lives, or Instagram or Twitter, and these massive town squares. And this idea that at the end of the day, these platforms exist, or these circles exist because of each individual's contributions. But there's never been a way to sort of effectively compensate them or reward them or have them really participate in that upside, when at the end of the day, like, why does Instagram exist? Instagram exists because we all choose to post really interesting content on there. Why does Tumblr or Facebook exist? Because we're contributing content to the network. And so far, Web2, the predominant revenue model was advertising. And so then we then effectively became the customer, right? That whole argument or that whole case study. And so this was just an early exploration of, can you create sustainable networks or platforms or groups whereby everyone, has to sort of transact to join by buying tokens or being sent tokens to participate in a network. And that from what you put in, if it creates value, then the experiment that hypothetically the value of that network should go up, and you should be able to participate that in whether you want to, hold or sell your tokens and be able to sort of participate in the economy that's being created on top of this group of individuals, which, is now about 7,000, 8,000 token holders.
That's fascinating. And I'm excited to dive in later about how to keep something cool, how to sustain the cool factor as well, and keep people wanting to come back. But I want to sort of dive into who is Alex Zhang for a little bit. Obviously, right now, you hold a very interesting role, which is being the ultimate community builder and community leader of the FWB squad. But what did you do before FWB, and how did it set you up for success for this role?
I want to maybe provide a little, like, FWB is made up of so many amazing people. And I'm definitely not like the ultimate community builder. I'm sort of just, I've always viewed myself as like a steward or someone who is good at facilitation, but there's so many people who have come before me and will come after me in terms of contributing to what makes FWB work. And I think what makes it work is it isn't relying on one specific individual, if that makes sense. But I appreciate the commentary nonetheless. I guess to my background, or I guess a little bit of how I got involved with this space, I've always just been fascinated with people. I think that's kind of been my obsession since I was a young child. I think growing up in white suburbia outside of Los Angeles, being a sort of a Chinese American kid, my parents are immigrants, from Beijing. I quickly realized how important community felt to me and what fitting in felt like or fitting out felt like, and quickly became sort of this floater where I really enjoyed sort of the overlap of multiple different disciplines, right? I never liked being put in a box. I never liked things that were put in boxes. And I always enjoyed, at least at an early age, the blending of different disciplines and areas, whether it was in high school, just different social circles, from hanging out with the athletes to kids who skateboarded to, all the AP classes I was in, to college and beyond, where I was always interested in this intersections of culture, media, technology, people, events, large scale gatherings. Just those little gray areas were what always got me, I guess, metaphorically out of bed. And that really manifested in college, where I think college is kind of that first ultimate playground where you're in that primordial zone where you're sort of an adult, but not really. You don't have the responsibilities of an adult, but you have the freedom of an adult. And so I just started to really, really experiment with those edges and started a lot of different community organizations on campus, played a leadership role in many different ones, helped run the student radio station where we managed 100 DJs and helped create sort of an independent music culture on campus, and through festivals and events, concerts, to the always interested in technology. And so we helped start and run sort of the on-campus venture fund and on-campus co-working spaces and on-campus sort of accelerator programs where we'd help students who wanted to launch projects, nonprofits, companies, mobile apps, websites, you name it, kind of help them find resources, and was interested in where those areas actually overlapped. Frankly, it was when sort of the music and the cultural stuff would overlap with the hard cutting edge technology, AI, 3D printing, software design sort of side of everything. And then that took me to the next chapter following college, where I wanted an even bigger playground. And I got connected to the folks who had started Summit Series, which was a global community of about 20,000 community members all around the world who had been gathering over a series of events across really the world, major conferences, major gatherings. Sort of the easiest way to describe Summit is sort of TED meets Burning Man, in that you sort of have this TED-like quality of content, discussions, thought leadership, intellectual discourse, but then you've got the Burning Man sort of fun, edge, co-created, wild party environment, all fused together into a 72-hour experience. And so joined there, wore every single different hat there, got to see how a large scale community operates, runs, grows, contracts, expands, etc. And mostly played creative roles there, helped steward the art program there. So worked with dozens and dozens of artists to create large scale installations and sculptural works and exhibitions, ran creative brand and marketing there, and then ultimately stepped into a CEO role there for 2 years and really got to see the strengths and the challenges of running a community of that scale, especially one that exists as a traditional corporate sort of business model. And we accomplished a lot as a community. We crowdfunded and purchased Powder Mountain, which was the largest ski resort in North America, as a place where we could all spend time and live on the land and ski and hang, and built about 200 homes there. And
do you guys still own Powder Mountain?
Yeah, it's still a project. Yeah, I was there a couple of weeks ago checking it out and seeing kind of the latest. And that's been a really exciting project, as well as, there's a venture fund attached to it, an institute where we fund sort of labs and nonprofit research. So all that was sort of emergent from the Summit community. But in my time in a leadership role there, that was when I really started to get into Web3 and sort of the theories and the history and the provenance and the exciting futures of what Web3 could sort of create. And as it relates specifically to, what I call kind of large scale human coordination or large scale community building, and that I started to just get really frustrated by communities that sort of existed within the container of a corporate structure, right? And I think what I started to notice was that communities actually shouldn't be thought of as businesses that exist to generate profit that return to shareholders, which would be, the sort of fundamental existence of a corporation, but instead should be thought of more as economies or thought of as markets, where there can still be sort of TLV, right? Total lock value, or there could still be market cap of company, but stakeholders should fundamentally be its citizens, as opposed to the owners of that company that employ employees and sort of treat everyone like employees, right? And so for Friends with Benefits, that was sort of the initial conversation that Trevor and I had that got me really excited about DAOs and meeting a lot of different people about 2 years ago who were thinking about what DAOs were and what DAOs could become. No one had the answers, we still don't, but at least the exploration that a DAO could provide a structure that would hopefully offer different opportunities and different levers to pull than the sort of one-dimensional corporation, which has a little bit more of a myopic sort of existence, if that makes sense. And so that sort of then led me into this final chapter or this current chapter of Friends with Benefits, where when I joined and started participating as a community member, it was a couple hundred people in a Discord group chat, and began to think about how to layer on different tools, different avenues, different neighborhoods, we call them, like how people in FWB participate and connect with each other. And that's been a really fun and exhilarating ride with its ups and its downs, but just, really collaborating with the FWB community as an exploration of an organization that can sort of exist outside of the traditional confines of a community business and function more as a community economy, where you're seeing, velocity of people interacting with the token, sending it between each other, experimenting with how the token can be used to create goods and services. What does our fiscal policy look like? What does our immigration policy look like? What does our import export policy look like, right? Like things that would actually, you would apply design towards a city or a country as opposed to a business, and allow for the participants of that network to think of themselves more as citizens of a network or citizens of a city or a country participating in an economy as opposed to users or customers of a company. It's kind of been the progression.
So one of my most interesting takeaways from that, though, is it seems like Web3 has actually started to enable a lot of people who are maybe not your programmers, product managers traditionally, to have a really fulfilling role doing something meaningful. So for someone like you, it sounds like you've just had a breadth of experience, and especially doing a lot of community work. That's traditionally not something that is enabled by tech, but now that is completely something that is enabled and amplified by tech. So that's super fascinating as a way for more people to play a role within the ecosystem. Going into the governance, urban planning, economy discussion, I do want to get into your interest of urban planning and how you're inspired by that. What are some of those core principles within urban planning and human organization that you study and you apply to your day-to-day work today?
A lot of the community and the folks in FWB have heard me kind of on this spiel for a bit, but I think a big unlock we had early on as it related to what sort of FWB is and was this theory that FWB was actually more of a city than it was a company or whatever, and or a user base. And leaning into that, had found a lot of exciting literature and research and sort of background in architecture, urban planning, urban theory, and found it to be like the most sort of salient connection point between community building, especially at scale. A lot of this was informed from the time working on the Powder Mountain project, the ski resort project, right? Because we bought, this 10,000 acre ski resort with the community, and there's all this sort of preserved land, in sort of a designated area. A vision of it was to build a small town, right? This idea of like a main street with houses and apartments and condos, in a ski village with the necessary infrastructure to have that be sort of self-sustaining. And during that process, encountered a lot of really incredible individuals and collaborators and also historical texts from Jane Jacobs and Christopher Alexander and sort of a theory and a philosophy that I really identified with, to, studying a lot of other architects like Le Corbusier or Louis Mumford, or different folks who had alternating perspectives of how cities should be built, and I skew much more towards this theory that, Christopher Alexander speaks about a lot in pattern language and a timeless way of building, which is about like, how do you identify existing living patterns that are already occurring? And then how do you build in relationship with those patterns? So rather than build and they will come mentality like Le Corbusier, it's more about how to identify what's already happening, where are people already gathering, what are people already interacting in, and how do you build tools on top of that to enable that and facilitate that at a more efficient or pleasurable rate or whatever, right? And so that sort of approach became really clear early on, and as a sort of a governing principle for the team at FWB, and thinking a lot about like, cool, how do we facilitate individuals in what they're already doing? So that's sort of like a macro perspective of like how we choose to allocate resources or sort of flow in different areas. On a more tactical level, early design of what the FWB Discord would even look like. We borrowed a lot of this from thinking about a great city has private infrastructure and public infrastructure, right? The idea that, New York City, as an example, Central Park is an incredible public infrastructure that's sort of maintained by the city that anyone is able to access for free. And if you can create the right public infrastructure, you can create spaces where a mosaic of subcultures, as Christopher Alexander would call it, would gather and sort of convene, right? This idea that in Central Park, you'll run into people from the Upper West Side and Bushwick because they'll travel great distances and lengths to immerse themselves in these strong public infrastructures, right? something that can both be incredibly valuable and free to access. So for Friends with Benefits, we think a lot about like, what are these different public infrastructure touch points look like, where different types of people, whether you're a deep Web3 nerd and you're building a protocol, all the way to a artist, creative nerd who sits on is a different type of a nerd. And what are those spaces in which you might interact and convene and come in contact with someone you might not normally come in contact with? So everything from like high level design theory as to like how we make decisions, all the way into like tactical things, like what are like the sticky points what are the touch points in which community members interact with each other? A lot of it is just informed by just an urban planning framework that like community, like a city, is just a collection of individuals with different backgrounds and different stories. And it's about creating the public infrastructure, like the roads and the power and the sewage and the directions and the subway systems, to allow for people to connect and gather with one another. So we're just thinking about that in sort of a digital context or a digital lens.
All right. So first takeaway, everyone in Friends with Benefits is just a nerd of some sort. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're all just nerds.
Definitely cool to be a nerd now. So you talk a lot about urban planning. You talk a lot about how existing cities come together. I'm kind of curious. So right now, DAOs are in quite a nascent phase. And so a lot of the existing structures look very primitive, very disorganized. But as I view the progression of Friends with Benefits, as well as some other more developed DAOs, it actually feels like a lot of the governing structures start to evolve into looking like what things like government structures or even corporate structures look like. So I'm curious to hear what you think about this desire for decentralization, because there is still this feeling like Web3 is all about decentralized organization, and whether or not it probably will end up evolving to look pretty much like how things are today.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And it's something that, we spent a lot of time thinking about. I think there's two schools of thoughts. I think there's one in that like, it's not totally necessary to completely reinvent the wheel, right? And that like a lot of existing structures, like I don't think all corporate structures or all municipal structures are bad, right? There's a reason why, you have this idea of direct democracy versus representative democracy exists. It's why you have like, a lot of these frameworks that have been sort of true and tried. Is there room for improvement? Definitely. But I think why you're seeing a lot of DAOs kind of land in similar stages of like, cool, this kind of looks like a version of city government or corporate government. Even like we joke around like student body government of just like electing different like, representatives for different areas, is because a lot of the tooling hasn't fully caught up yet, right? In the last week, we've seen 3 major hacks go down in like the crypto ecosystems, the Solana ecosystem, the Nomad ecosystem. Like, and a lot of that is really unfortunate because I think it just continues to decrease confidence in the space around like fully trustless protocols, right? Where you don't have sort of a central group managing security or a central group sort of managing sort of checks and balances around certain things. And it's not explicitly because of that. It's just more so to show like in a fully trustless environment, there's a lot more room for like exploits to sort of occur. And I think, and it's a way to back in hopefully that the technology will continue to innovate and improve to create like truly secure, trustless systems, which exist. And we're beginning to see DAOs operate with some of those tools in really sophisticated ways. I think things like Nouns DAO is an interesting DAO that actually is really decentralized and distributed. Granted, it's a small cohort right now, about like 200 or 300 members. And that's a totally different level of decision making than 5,000 members or 6,000 members. But all in all, I think the intuition of currently relying on existing systems because they've worked in the past and slightly marginally improving them is unfortunately where it feels like a lot of the current industry is at, because a lot of the tooling hasn't sort of been fully caught up yet. However, the second area I would mention is I do believe in a world of like moving more towards this decentralization. I don't love the word decentralization. I think of more of just like redistribution, almost like distribution of power. I think a lot of people are like, oh, decentralization means no leader. I actually think decentralization means like proper decentralization, the way we're referencing it, is actually having a lot of leaders. It's not being leaderless, it's being more leaderful, right? It's having multiple people who can step up and step into roles and play leadership roles, but have it be a lot more fluid. I think when there is no leader, that's when things devolve into chaos. Even like Nouns DAO, as an example, has a very strong group of leadership, even though it's quite distributed. And so this idea that, to your question about like, does this end up looking like a lot of the existing structures? I think right now it sort of does, because I think a lot of the tooling isn't quite there yet. But I think this next chapter of Web3 and DAOs should hopefully pull ahead, where there'll be a lot more exciting innovation and progress made, where organizations, communities can create structures to be more conducive to having multiple leaders exist in more of these decentralized capacities. And that's definitely on our mind at Friends with Benefits, an extent of this next chapter of FWB. having elections and allowing for other leaders to step in. We've always had sort of open and transparent reporting, but creating a lot more open and transparent decision-making processes, all these stuff that I think this idea that, yeah, my title as the mayor was sort of coined because mayors are termed and there's a passage of power and a passing of the baton versus a dictator, right? Or a CEO where it's sort of up to the CEO and that board to make those sort of executive decisions in sort of perpetuity. So yeah, I think a lot of it is using tried and true systems and sort of playing with them in ways that suit our specific community's needs, but hopefully it's designed in an upgradable way where based on the needs of our time, it can evolve and mature and sort of iterate and improve.
Yeah, I really like that this is where a lot of leaders in the space are converging to, because there was a bit of an anarchist belief that, DAOs are fully decentralized. Everyone's kind of their own autonomous agent. They're all doing their own thing, running in different directions. But this is really showing that we're starting to mature as an ecosystem. And I also feel like it respects a lot of history and existing principles of how to organize people and just natural ways in which people organize themselves, while more focusing on tools, infrastructure, technology to really improve how people organize. I want to talk a bit about the value of DAOs and how you think that extends to the future. What I personally have really enjoyed is obviously the online sphere is where I get a lot of discovery and exposure. I can see who's out there, what people are talking about, what's generally happening. But I've actually benefited the most when I've had in real life experiences, whether it's what you guys are doing in a couple of weeks, Friends with Benefits Festival, which sounds super awesome. How do you think about the evolution of online communities potentially moving more and more offline or having a very sort of symbiotic relationship with one another? And also, how do you more and more solidify FWB as what people actually associate with as a city, right? Because in some ways right now it's still more of an online club. And so what does it mean to actually make it into a city?
Yeah, great questions. I'll start with, I guess, the first one of the relationship between IRL and URL. I think for us, I don't want to create a blanket statement of like, oh, all online communities need to be thinking about IRL, because that's the truth is they don't, right? I think it completely depends on the values and the goals and the North Star or the reason why that group of people exist. For us, like FWB has really strong DNA in art, music, culture, entertainment, where a lot of those spaces have strong IRL endpoints, right? Music, festivals, right? Concerts, art, gallery shows, openings, and a lot of us, despite all of us having met during COVID, all have degrees of separation away from each other, where a lot of us have what you constantly hear in FWB is, oh, I've known that person for like 10 years through music. And oh, I've known that person for 5 years through this. I didn't know that they'd be in FWB. There are strong degrees of connectivity that exist and that create a reason for existence. And so IRL plays a very important role in FWB's sort of roadmap or growth or focus areas, because we've always thought of FWB that the sort of strength of the overall community is really defined by those one-on-one connection points, right? Like it's this sort of network effect of many to many, where just like any other social network, it won't be fun if you're chatting with the same person over and over and over, but it really is about like the collectiveness of a network of people and that sort of many to many touch points. And so one thing we began thinking about early on was like, oh, if we throw these events, this will naturally create much stronger connective points, because just even the pure of going online to offline of someone you've been chatting with over Discord for 3 months or 6 months, and then meeting them in person totally recontextualizes that relationship and thus recontextualizes the overall experience, right? The Discord starts to feel less like this abyss or this like group chat with pseudonyms and avatars. And it begins to feel more like, oh, like I met a bunch of you guys at FWB Fest last weekend and I know most of you now. And now that name that pops up asking a question about, did you hear this new record that just came out, has a totally different level of context, right? And so I would say it's very important for us and for FWB and for online communities who really want to bridge beyond Web3 or beyond the metaverse. In terms of how this actually starts to look like a city, I think this upcoming weekend at FWB Fest is going to be a really interesting experiment of that, right? I think we chose this festival grounds of the Idlewild Arts Academy, which is a private arts high school in the mountains of California, as a location for our first festival, because it already has the infrastructure of what a mini town or a city would look like. It's got a little cafeteria, it's got an auditorium, it's got a town square, it's got natural hikes and paths and rivers, and it's designed to feel like what happens when 500 people from the FWB community land in a campus that's already designed architecturally or infrastructurally like a city, what will those online patterns look like manifested offline? So we're going to experiment with what that looks like, right? And we're going to experiment with this idea of people sort of participating in an environment like that, where we get to almost like LARP or live action role play, what 4 days of living together in a city might look like, and use that as kind of a litmus test of ways to continue to grow and push that.
Is there a world where you buy another mountain resort and just create an entire city for people that own FWB tokens? That'd be awesome. I'd vouch for it.
Maybe. There's definitely been fever dreams and fun ideas and discussions about that. But I think a lot of the utopian, or it can even get lumped into techno-utopian visions of like, oh, let's create a city and live totally off grid together. Like a lot of that isn't fully sustainable. I think, the Powder Mountain Project, I think, has a potential of working in the long term because it has a core recreational component where people go to leisure, right? To ski, to hike, to be in the great outdoors there. I think to create a fully autonomous town where everyone lives there is incredibly hard, because what it'll lack in the beginning is often a diversity of thought. Even everyone who holds FWB token and an FWB who goes, there will already be a somewhat homogenous culture, which would be like Web3 or whatever, right? So I think definitely interested in lightweight experiments of that, real estate, physical properties, places where FWB members can convene together. But I think there's a lot of homework and studying to be done around individuals who want to actually go out and create their own sort of cities, and a lot of the implications that may arise from that.
Yeah, I guess like playing on that theme a little bit, maybe it's not a literal city that we develop in the future, because we don't need those geographical boundaries anymore, especially if people are virtually connected from everywhere. But going back to the original ethos, or what FWB was known for in the early days, which is just a bunch of friends with a shared bank account, what if you can co-invest in different properties across the world or different assets across the world, so that in that way you get a lot more access physically and virtually. So speaking of tools and allowing people to do cool things, I know that FWB is working on a lot of really interesting tools to help with community organization and creating, online social spaces. How do you see that evolve in the future? I mean, is there a world where FWB or other DAOs replace the current social media products? Or do you think it's going to take a different direction where perhaps it's always going to be more of an enabler for other people, and then the communities themselves can choose how they actually utilize these tools?
We're really interested in the software side, right? We're really interested in what is vertically integrated community software look like. We talk a lot about that as a group, right? If you have vertically integrated companies or manufacturers, this idea that it's advantageous to own the full stack, we're interested in like, what are the tools that can be built and stewarded by that community, as opposed to, having everything live on everyone else's platforms, if that makes sense, and creating sort of modular, composable tools for you to plug and play with other folks. But ultimately that provenance and that ownership and that value accrual goes back into that sort of community, right? And so for us, we're spending a lot of time thinking about community software, right? What are the tools that we can create for the community, for other communities even, to create more sovereignty, create more ownership, and create more interactivity between community members? So a big first sort of foray into that is thinking about creating our own identity solutions, right? And creating our own sort of social networking tools where, we don't want to replace Discord, or we don't want to replace Facebook. I think that would be Herculean efforts. I think it's more so like, what does our community need deeply? To us, it feels like identity, and a better way to sort of create identity within FWB. How many events have you gone to? Who are you? What kind of art and music do you like? What are ways to create higher signal that like, oh, Annie and Alex would be really good friends, if we didn't know each other, and begin to introduce some of that software tooling as a way to kind of further accelerate FWB's reason for existence, which is to drive even more authentic, connection and conversations between people in Web3 and culture. So a big feature of FWB is definitely sort of community-owned software in the sort of vertically integrated lane. And then on top of that, I think another big area is beginning to selectively pick areas that feel ready to be sufficiently decentralized. So an example would be, FWB has been around for about a year and a half now of throwing these events. We had an events team that threw events for the community. We experimented with 3 months ago this idea of the event keys, where different community members could apply to throw an event, and FWB would sort of grant them a permit to throw an event with the FWB branding. And then that would go on our official events calendar, and then community members would go to it and they would earn tokens for it. I think the next step into that is beginning to exit 75-80% of our events to the community, where now there's a dedicated pool of funding. Community members can apply and vote and select what events they want to create and host, whether that's a hike in the south of France, to a movie screening night in Lisbon, to a sandwich deli tour in Philly. I think we had a proposal about that a couple days ago, a tour of all the best sandwich shops in Philadelphia, and then allowing for community members to earn tokens for that. And then additionally to find ways to sort of scale FWB's physical footprints in cities that like might not make sense for us to centrally plan events around. So a big area where FWB goes from here is also like expansion and diversification of our event offerings, being much more community and grassroots organized, as opposed to coming from even like, our core event planning team, because we felt like at this stage, we sort of set the cadence and the beat for what an FWB event looks and feels like.
That's awesome. I really look forward to that. I mean, in some ways, it feels like it's not going to be a replacement for the existing social media model. It's almost a complement. People can still use maybe Instagram to connect with everyone and have access to everyone in the world, but maybe FWB creates the tooling to have more of these richer, specific experiences.
Exactly.
I want to talk about what it means to be in the intersection of culture, people, and technology, because when you hear that, it sounds super sexy, right? It's like, okay, that's where the cool kids are hanging out. That's where things are happening. But it's really hard to define what that means and how to succeed at it. And in many ways, FWB has created the appeal to really pull people in and make it feel like it is the nexus of culture and technology and people. So is there any way for you to quantify or enumerate what that means, and like what are some of those hot buttons that you hit when it comes to trying to attract people who are interested in that intersectionality? Just give us a more greater articulation of how to appeal to people within that space.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first off, it's more of an art than a science, right? I think, and by art, I mean, just like when you look at great art, visual art, or when you listen to great music, it's hard to enumerate why you feel attracted to that specific piece, right? Just like humans, attraction towards humans, it often is difficult to enumerate what specifically, is it their features? Is it their energy? Like without sounding too like woo woo, there's a certain energy, I think, that comes from people who are able to really curate and compile a sort of plethora of inputs that ultimately generate really interesting and exciting outputs. And so, yeah, when I say an intersectionality of culture, technology, media, it's a lot of buzzwords. But what I mean is it's just maybe in its most abstracted form, it's a group of people with very interested, specific expertise in a lot of areas who are coming together and who want to do nothing else but just learn and share and are curious. And I think you feel that when you walk into a room. It's just like when you walk into a really great party, how do you describe what makes that party so good? Is it the lighting? Is it the food? Is it the music? Each of those contribute to it. It's like the orchestration of everything together that just happens to be working at that moment in time. You even mentioned like earlier on, how do you keep things cool? I think that's already the wrong way of thinking about it, because I think cool is subjective and cool is fluid, right? I think things will move from cool to not cool very quickly, where like even FWB, to the new person who just joins, might think it's the coolest person, to the person who's been here for 3 years might not think it's the coolest thing because they've been there for 3 years, but they establish a different relationship with it, and that it plays a different role in their life. And so maybe the question behind the question is like, how can other people create intersectionalities like this that attract a global community of people? I think the key thing is just authenticity. It's not approaching it formulaically of like, if I add these 3 things together, will that create that? It's more like playing jazz, where it's just like, get the right players in the room and like y'all will sort of figure it out, right? And then making sure that you're doing things authentically and humbly and being willing to like change or try new things or evolve, or like I mentioned, kind of allow for things to sort of die, to be reborn, to then die again. Like very Tao Te Ching of me, in terms of just let it take on different life cycles.
I think that is an art in itself. You don't get mastery overnight. So it's really cool to see that you guys have really found your stride and got the right vibe to bring these people together. My last question to you is just around like fun facts or epic things that you guys have been able to pull off running FWB. What were some of those most epic experiences or interactions or outcomes because this DAO has existed?
Yeah, I mean, the list goes on and on of sort of companies that were started outside of FWB or inside of FWB where the founders met each other there through a hackathon or a project or even just a Discord. I think A lot of artwork and music has been created. I've done a lot of really exciting and interesting auctions with the community that have resulted in really exciting initiatives that have been born. Like we did this interesting auction with Matthew Ball, the Metaverse sort of author and essay. The proceeds of that auction would go to starting a Metaverse Alliance DAO to fund sort of an open and interoperable Metaverse. That's being worked on. So a lot of these things that have sort of trailed in and out of FWB have come about when thinking about FWB really as a sort of like open and agnostic platform.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for all of your wisdom today. Thanks for coming onto the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
That was Alex Zhang, the mayor of FWB DAO. You can find him on Twitter as Zhang, and you can check out what FWB is all about at fwb.help. If you like this episode, help leave a review in your podcast app of choice. As always, thank you for listening. This is your host, Annie Zhang, and I will see you in 2 weeks.